Clara Vess had taught for 9 years and owned one trunk. Every October, she packed that trunk and left the county. Because a schoolteacher on $40 a month cannot stay where she is not renewed. She had learned to travel light. She had learned not to hang anything on a wall. Then, one April morning, she found a heifer calf standing in her school pen, freshly branded. Ear-notched, steam coming off its back in the cold, and no note anywhere. The iron burned into its hip belonged to Amos Renner, a rancher she had spoken to maybe 4 times in her life. At the store, the widow McTeague folded her hands on the counter and set it low. "That's Renner's mark, child. Best you not ask. And best the board never hear of it." Before long, 400 people in the Cimarron country knew about that calf, and every one of them had quietly agreed that 2 men never would. By the 4th spring, she had 11 head, and a secret a whole county was keeping for her. And not one word from the man who started it. Not in 4 years. Then came the 5th spring. And the branding day passed, and the pen stayed empty. If you have ever worked for years and been left with nothing that was yours to keep, this story is for you. If it found you tonight, take 1 second and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I like to know who's out there in the dark with me. Now let me take you back. Back to the first cold morning of it all. The Cimarron country was flat, and it was mean, and it went on forever. No trees to speak of, wind that never quit. In summer, the grass ran gold to the edge of the sky, and in winter, the whole world turned the color of an old bone. People called it no man's land back then. The territory hadn't decided yet whose it was. That suited the folks who came there. Most of them hadn't decided either. Clara came to teach in the spring of 1882. She was 28 years old. She had a straight back and a plain gray dress and hands that were always chalked white at the knuckles. The children loved her before the first week was out. She had a way of leaning down to a slate that made a slow child feel like the only one in the room. Hers was a subscription school. That meant the families paid what they could. $1 here. A sack of cornmeal there. The board made up the rest when the board felt like it. Her term was 9 months, $40 a month, and at the end of it, 3 men would sit around a store counter and vote on whether to have her back. She did not own the schoolhouse. She did not own the desk she wrote at. She did not even own a bed. A teacher in that country boarded around. 2 weeks at the McTeague soddy. 2 weeks at the Halvorsen dugout. A month with a family clear out on the Beaver, sleeping on a shakedown by the stove with 4 children and a sick calf. She kept her whole life in that one trunk so she could pick it up and go. She could not save. There was nothing to save. $40 went to boarding fees and to shoe leather and to the little things a teacher buys with her own money because the board won't. Slate pencils. A primer for the Kessler boy whose father drank. She gave more of that salary away than she ever put in her pocket. And she could not stay. Not really. Not in any way that counted. A vote could end her. A vote had ended teachers before her. She knew their names. Miss Pauline Ott, who had lasted 2 terms and then been let go. The reason written in the board book was thin as paper. The appearance of an attachment. There had been a young man, a freighter, who came to church too often and sat too near. Nothing was ever proved. Nothing needed to be. The morals clause did not require proof. It required only that Harlan Pruitt raise his eyebrows. Before Miss Ott there had been a Miss Deakins, same clause, same eyebrows. Gone before Christmas. So Clara kept herself narrow. She did not sit near anyone. She did not laugh too long with the fathers who brought their children in. She wore the gray dress and she chalked her knuckles, and she loved the schoolhouse the only safe way there was. The way you love a thing you know you'll have to leave. That was the woman Amos Renner never spoke to. She had seen him, of course. Everyone had. He ran the broken R south of the schoolhouse, 11 miles of grass and a low house and a set of corrals he'd built himself. He was a big, quiet man in the middle of his 30s, sunburned to the collar. He came to church about half the Sundays, and he sat in the back, and he left before the last hymn was through. She could not have told you the color of his eyes. She had never stood close enough to learn. 4 times they had spoken. Once about the weather. Once when she dropped a glove and he handed it back without a word, just held it out. Once at a funeral. Once when his wagon and hers met on the same track and one had to give way. And he gave way, and tipped his hat, and that was all. Now here was his iron, burned into the hip of a calf, standing in her pen at first light on a branding morning. She had come out to fetch water. The frost was still on everything, and it went pink when the sun touched it. And there it was, a red heifer calf, blocky and healthy, blowing steam. It looked at her the way calves do, dumb and curious, and it did not run. Her first thought was that it had strayed. That was reasonable. Cattle wandered. A calf could slip a fence and cover ground in the night, but the pen gate was latched. She stood there and looked at that latch a long moment. It was thrown from the outside, dropped down clean into its keeper. No calf did that. No calf latched a gate behind itself. Somebody had led that heifer into her pen in the dark and shut it in and gone away. She let it be that day. She had 30 children to teach and no time to solve a riddle. But she thought about it through every lesson. She thought about the latch. She thought about the fresh brand, still raw at the edges, meaning that calf had been marked within a day. She thought about it walking home, and she thought about it lying awake on the McTeague shakedown while the widow snored soft across the room. In the morning, it was still there. Waiting, she'd left it a little hay, and it had eaten every straw. She went to the store 2 days after for chalk. The store was the whole town, near enough. Post office in one corner, dry goods in another, and Harlan Pruitt behind the counter weighing out nails for a homesteader. Pruitt was the storekeeper, and he was also the president of the school board, and the two facts lived in the same man like a hawk and its shadow. Clara was quiet by the shelf of school things, counting her coins, when 2 men by the stove got to talking. Land talk. It was always land talk in those days. One of them had come up from Fairbank, 40 miles east, where the land office was. He was saying how a body could file on a quarter section now, 160 acres, how the fee was small and the rules were loose, and how, this is the part that snagged in her without her knowing it snagged, how a single woman could enter land the same as a man. A widow, a spinster. It didn't matter. If she was of age and on her own, she could put her name on 160 acres of the territory, and no one could take it back. Clara heard it the way you hear rain on a far-off roof. Pleasant, not for her. She was a teacher. She had $40 a month and a trunk. Land was for people with money and a plow, and a man to swing it. She counted her coins and thought no more about it. Then she went to pay, and the widow McTeague was at the counter, and she saw the question in Clara's face before Clara asked it. The widow drew her aside, toward the bolts of cloth where Pruitt couldn't hear. She was a small woman, Odessa McTeague, dressed in black these 6 years, and sharp as a tack under the morning. She took Clara's wrist. "You've got a calf," she said, "not a question." Clara nodded. "With a brand you don't know. A kind of an R," Clara said. Broken across the top. The widow's mouth went still. She looked once toward the counter, toward Pruitt's broad back, and she lowered her voice till it was almost nothing. "That's Renner's mark, child, the broken R. Amos Renner, south of your school." She squeezed the wrist. "Now you listen to me, because I'll only say it the once. Best you not ask him why. Best you not ask anybody why. And best of all, the board never hears a word of it. You understand me?" Not Pruitt. Not any of them. Clara understood the words. She did not understand the thing under them. "But whose is it?" she said. "The calf. What do I do with it?" "It's yours," the widow said. "That's what you do. You keep it." And she let go of the wrist and picked up her parcel and walked out into the wind, and that was the whole of the conversation. That was the first stitch in a silence 400 people would go on to sew for 4 years. Clara walked home slow that evening with her chalk in her pocket and her mind turning over. A rancher she'd spoken to 4 times had cut a calf out of his herd and branded it and had it walked 11 miles north in the dark and shut it in her pen and said nothing, and a whole town seemed to already know and to have already decided she should keep quiet and keep the animal. It made no sense as kindness. Kindness had a face. It said here, "This is for you. From me." This had no face. This was left in the dark and denied in the daylight. She lay awake on it again. And somewhere in that second sleepless night, the schoolteacher's mind did what a schoolteacher's mind does. It started to count. A heifer was not a piece of meat. She knew that much of stock, growing up the way she had. A heifer was a mother. Give her 2 years and she'd throw a calf of her own, and that calf, if it was a heifer, would throw another. 1 became 2. 2 became 4. Slow but sure as arithmetic. It compounded. It grew while you slept and while you traveled, and while a board sat around a counter and voted on your life. A salary could be cut. A term could go unrenewed. Money in a poke could be spent down to nothing in a hard winter. But a herd increased. It was the one kind of wealth a woman on term pay could ever hope to hold, the one thing that got bigger without her lifting a hand. She sat up in the dark of the soddy, and she understood. Not why he had done it. That she would not understand for years, but what it was. What it could become. If she said nothing. If she kept it. If she let the arithmetic run. The next morning she bought a small book. Ruled pages, pasteboard cover, cost her a nickel. On the first line she wrote the date, and under it she wrote, "1 heifer, red, broken R, found in pen." She did not write his name. She'd learned that much from the widow already. That was her tally book. She would carry it for 4 years, and every line she added would be a line the school board could not vote away. The branding at the Broken R came later that same spring, and it was the whole country's day. You have to understand what branding was out there. It wasn't one man in a fire. It was the calendar. Neighbors rode in from 30 miles. The women cooked for 2 days. Children got turned loose to run wild, while the men worked the herd in the dust and the bawling and the stink of singed hair. 400 souls, easy, spread across Renner's home pasture, because when a big outfit branded, the whole community came to help and to watch and to eat. Clara went. Everyone went. A teacher who stayed home from a branding would have been the strange one. So she stood at the rail with the widow McTeague and the Halvorsen girls, and she watched. She watched Amos Renner work his own herd. He was good at it. Quiet and quick, the way big men sometimes are, never wasting emotion. The calves came through the chute, and the irons came out of the fire red hot, and it was loud, and it was fast. And then, near the end of it, she saw him do the thing. He cut 1 heifer out. He did it plain, in front of everybody, and yet somehow nobody's head turned but hers. A red heifer calf, weaned and blocky. He pushed it out of the working herd and into a small holding pen off to the side, alone. Then he called over a boy, a hired boy, one of the Torvald young ones, maybe 15, and he said something short to him, and he pointed. North. Just that, a tilt of the head and a hand thrown north. Toward the schoolhouse, toward her pen, 11 miles up the flat. The boy nodded like it was the most ordinary errand in the world. He'd do it that night or the next when the work was done, walk that 1 calf the 11 miles under the stars, and shut it in a half-acre pen and walk home. No rider staying. No note left. Nothing said, and 400 people saw it. That was the thing that turned Clara cold and warm at once, standing at that rail. 400 people saw Amos Renner cut a heifer from his herd and send it north, and not one of them said her name. Not one of them nudged a neighbor and grinned. The men looked and looked away. The women found something to do with their hands. The widow beside her stared straight ahead at the fire and said, "Quiet, not moving her lips much. Eat your dinner, child, don't watch." She had thought the silence was hers alone to keep. It wasn't. The whole county was in it now. They had all seen, and they had all decided together, without a meeting, without a word passed, to see and to shield. To keep it from the one man it had to be kept from, the man behind the store counter with the board book and the morals clause and the raised eyebrows. She was being looked after by people who would never once say so out loud. It was the loneliest, kindest thing she had ever stood in the middle of. That October, she packed the trunk and left the county, because that is what she had to do. The term ended. The board renewed her. Pruitt had no reason yet not to, but a 9-month term is a 9-month term, and there was no work and no pay in the dead of a panhandle winter. So she went east to her sisters in Kansas, the way she went every year. She rode out on the mail wagon with the trunk lashed behind and the whole flat country going brown behind her. And she left the calf. That was the thing that near broke her, that first October. Everything she'd ever had she'd carried. Now she had one thing she could not carry, and she had to set it down and walk away and trust the winter and the country to keep it for her. She needn't have feared. She learned that in January, when she came back with the first thaw and the new term. The heifer was in the McTeague lot, fat and slick, wintered on somebody's hay, whose, she never got a straight answer. The widow just said she's kept and left it there. The animal was heavier than in the fall. Tended, waiting, Clara stood at that lot fence in the January cold and put her hand flat on the warm red hide, and something happened in her chest that she did not have a good word for. 9 years of coming and going, and every year she came back to a place that had gone on without her, that owed her nothing, that would let her go again in the fall. This one year she had come back to something that was hers, that had survived her being gone, that the country had held for her while she slept 40 miles away. Rooted. That was the closest word. For the first time she felt one small root go down into that mean flat ground. She wrote in the tally book, "Heifer wintered, come through fat." And under it she drew a small line, and next to the line she made herself write the plain fact she was starting to build her life on. One head. The springs came on, one after another, the way springs do. 1883. Another branding day. Another calf cut out plain in front of the country and sent north in the dark. Clara found it in her pen on the frost, second verse the same as the first, no note, gate latched from outside. She wrote it in the book. 1884. A third. And this was the spring the arithmetic first paid her in her own coin, because her first heifer, a grown cow now, dropped a calf of her own out on the McTeague grass. She hadn't sent for that one, hadn't asked. It just came, the way she'd known it would, back when she sat up in the dark and understood what a heifer was. The herd made itself bigger while she taught her 30 children their sums. Forehead, she counted them in the tally book, and she looked at the 4 small lines, and she felt the strangest kind of rich. And through those 2 springs, the small, silent things kept happening. She learned to watch for them the way you learn the habits of a wild thing you're trying to name. The pen gate. A hinge went bad on it one fall, rusted through, hanging by a nail. She meant to see to it and hadn't the money for the iron. She left for Kansas with it broke. She came back in January and it was rehung. New hinge, set square, a job done by somebody who knew how to hang a gate. No word of who. She asked the widow and got a shrug. The hay. One hard December, she wasn't even in the county, she heard it after. A load of good winter hay showed up stacked by her pen. No name on it. Just there, the way the first calf had been just there. Enough to carry her small herd through the worst of it. And the box supper. That was the sharpest one. And she was the only living soul who caught it. There was a box supper that third spring, at the Broken R, a church social, the whole country again, tables set up and lanterns strung, the young women's baskets auctioned off to raise money for the new church roof. A man bid on a basket, and whoever's basket it was, he ate his supper with her. It was courting done in daylight, safe and public, and blessed by the preacher. Clara sat at the long table and she watched Amos Renner across the yard, and she saw that he bid on nothing, and she saw that he ate nothing. He stood at the edge of his own social with his hat in his hands, and he watched the lanterns, and he did not once come near the tables. A man throwing a party at his own place, feeding 40 families, and taking not one bite himself. Nobody else marked it. Why would they? He was a quiet man, and quiet men keep to the edges. But Clara had learned his hand by then. She had learned his iron by heart, the Broken R, tracing it 100 times in the tally book. And she was starting, without letting herself say it, to learn the man. And she saw that he would not sit at a table where he might have to sit near her, that he had built a whole evening of nearness and then held himself 11 miles of manners away from the one person it was for. She did not understand it. She thought, God help her, she thought it might be that he found her nothing, that the calves were charity from a rich man to a poor teacher, the way you'd feed a stray, and that his keeping his distance meant she was less than nothing to him. That was the reading her blind spot gave her. She could not imagine being chosen by a man who never spoke. So she read the silence, the plainest, saddest way. As indifference. As a gift given the way you'd toss bread to a bird, without ever wanting the bird to land on your hand. She rode home from that box supper with an ache she was ashamed of, and she did not write it in the tally book, because the tally book was for facts, and she did not yet know that ache for a fact. By the second winter of it, she had stopped leaving the herd to chance. She hired the Halverson boy. Nils, the eldest, 14 and steady, glad of the 2 bits a week. Through the cold months, while she was gone to Kansas, Nils would run her little herd, 4 head now, then more. Feeding, watering, breaking ice on the trough. She paid him out of her own thin pocket and never once begrudged it. And somewhere in the arranging of that, the hiring, the counting, the planning ahead across a whole winter she wouldn't even be there for, her heart turned a corner. The bewilderment burned off. What was left was purpose, hard and bright. She stopped waiting to understand why. She decided it didn't matter why. Here was the fact of it. She had a thing that grew while she slept, that grew while she was 40 miles gone, that grew whether Pruitt raised his eyebrows or not, whether the board voted her back or turned her out. 4 teachers before her had been let go for the appearance of an attachment and had walked out of the county with exactly what they'd walked in with. Nothing. She would not be the 5th. Whatever else happened to her, the herd would go on increasing. It was the one wealth a board could not decline to renew. She wrote a new thing in the front of the tally book that winter, in her small square hand. Not a count. A kind of a vow. She wrote, "This grows if I stay or go. Keep it. Say nothing." Then came the day the arithmetic finally handed her a choice, which is a thing arithmetic had never done for her before. It was early in her 5th year of teaching there, the spring of 1885 coming on, when the letter arrived from Fairbank. 40 miles east, the bigger town, the one with the land office and the framed schoolhouse and money behind it. The Fairbank board wanted a teacher, a good one. Word of Clara Vess had traveled, the way word does. And their offer, laid out plain on good paper, was better than anything the Cimarron country had ever given her. A longer term, better pay. A real teacher's room she wouldn't have to give up every 2 weeks. A schoolhouse with a bell and glass in the windows and a floor that wasn't dirt. For 9 years, an offer like that would have decided itself. Clara Vess went where she was wanted because being wanted was the only ground she'd ever had to stand on. A better term was a better term. You did not turn down a roof over your head when you had spent your whole life carrying your roof in a trunk. She sat with the letter a long time by the schoolhouse stove, after the children were gone. Out the little window she could see, far off south, the low line of the Broken R. And nearer, right out her own door, the half-acre pen where a red heifer had stood on the frost 4 years back. She had 7 head now, counting the increase, 7 lines in the tally book, and 7 animals out on the grass that were hers and no one else's, wintered by a hired boy, watched over by a whole county that would never say why, and she understood, sitting there, that for the first time in 9 years she had a reason to stay that had nothing to do with anybody's vote. She could stay. Not because she was renewed, not because she was wanted, or kept, or tolerated. She could stay because she had something here that was hers, that was growing, that she did not want to leave. The herd had bought her the one thing $40 a month never could. A choice. She took a fresh sheet and she wrote to Fairbank, kind and short, and she thanked them, and she declined. And then she walked over to the store, past Pruitt at his counter, and she put her name to the Cimarron school for another term, and she did it easy, the way you'd sign for something you meant to keep. Pruitt blotted her signature and said she was a credit to the county, and she thanked him, and she went out into the spring wind feeling lighter than she had in 9 years of trunks. She did not know that across the store, by the stove, a man from Fairbank had been talking again. About their teacher search. About the young woman up in the Cimarron country who'd turned them down. Turned down better pay, mind you, and wasn't that a curious thing? A girl on nothing choosing to stay on less. And she did not know that Harlan Pruitt, blotting her name behind the counter, had heard him. And had let his eyes come up. And had begun, slow, the way a hawk turns its head, to wonder why. The 4th calf came the way the others had. Quiet, no note. She found it at first light on a branding day morning, standing on the frost in the half-acre pen, breath-smoking, a red heifer with the fresh Broken R burned into its hip. The gate was latched from the outside. Same as always. Clara stood at her door in her shawl and looked at it a long while, and the cold came up through the boards under her feet, and she did not go to it right away. She knew the mark by heart now. She could have drawn it with her eyes shut. Broken R his iron. 4 springs. 4 heifers driven 11 miles north in the dark by some hired boy who never once stayed to be thanked. And with the increase, the ones that had thrown their own calves by now. She counted her herd on her fingers, standing there in the doorway, and the count came to 11. 11 head of cattle that were hers. A woman on $40 a month and 1 trunk. She went and got the tally book off the shelf. The pasteboard cover was soft at the corners now from handling. She opened it, and she wrote the date, and she wrote the mark, and she made the line. 11 lines. She blew on her fingers, and she looked at that last one a long time. It had come on late that year. A hard frost the night before, unusual for the season, the grass silvered and stiff, the creek edged with ice that would be gone by noon. First thaw morning. Everything half froze and getting ready to give. She did not have a word for what she felt looking at that calf, and she had stopped trying to find one. Kindness, she called it when she called it anything, a kindness she could not account for. 4 years and the man had not spoken to her. Not one word. She had passed him on the road twice, and both times he'd touched his hat and looked at the ground and ridden on. She thought it was shyness. She thought maybe he was a man who couldn't get his words out. She was 28 when she came here, and she was 32 now, and in all those years she had never once let herself think it might be anything more than a strange man's charity to a schoolteacher he pitied. She was wrong about that. But she would not know it for another year. The letter from Fairbank had come that same spring, and she had answered it kind and short, and she had told them no. She'd re-signed the Cimarron school easy, the way you sign for something you mean to keep. And she had thought that was the end of Fairbank. It was not. Because in June a man came up from Fairbank in a good coat, driving a hired rig, and his name was Julius Barnes. He was a board man down there, and a widower, and he had heard about the young teacher in the Cimarron country who'd turned them down for less money, and he had decided to come and see her for himself. He was a decent man. She'd give him that always. He sat in Mrs. McTeague's front room with his hat on his knee, and he said his piece plain. "I'll say it straight, Miss Vess," he told her. "We'd have you at Fairbank at 55 a term. A framed schoolhouse with a real floor, not sod. And I'd not be shy to say I'd be calling on you myself, if you'd allow it." Words. He gave her words. Every one of them honest, and out loud in the light of day. She sat with her hands folded, and she thanked him. She said she'd think on it, and she watched him drive off south, and she stood at the window a good while after the dust settled. Odessa McTeague came and stood beside her. 6 years that woman had worn black, and there was nothing on this earth got past her. "That's a good man, Mrs. McTeague said. "He is," said Clara. "Says it all right out, don't he? $55 and calls on you, and a floor that isn't dirt." The widow folded her hands. "And the other one?" Clara didn't answer. "The other ones give you 11 head of cattle in 4 years and never said good morning." Mrs. McTeague turned from the window. "You think on which one costs you more, child. That's all I'll say." Clara did think on it. That summer she thought on little else. Barnes wrote her twice, careful letters in a careful hand. Renner sent nothing, because there was nothing to send till spring. And she could not have told you which silence she listened to harder. Then October came, and she packed the trunk. She always packed it the same. 9 years of packing it. The dresses first, then the books, then the little things at the top where they'd not get crushed. But this year she did not carry the whole of her life out of the county the way she used to. This year she had 11 head on the grass, and she could not take them, and she would not have if she could. She hired the Halverson boy again. Nils, 14 now, steady as a post, and she paid him 2 bits a week to see her herd through the winter, water and hay, and count them morning and night. She gave him the tally book to keep the count in while she was gone. "You write down anything happens," she told him. "Anything's born, anything dies, you write it." "Yes, ma'am." "And Nils." She stopped at the wagon. "You don't tell Mr. Pruitt the count." "If he asks." The boy looked at her. He was a Halvorson, and the Halvorsons knew everything the whole county knew. "No, ma'am," he said. "I won't." She went to Kansas for the winter, to her sister's, the way she always did. And the whole 11 miles of the Cimarron country closed over her herd like water over a stone, and kept it for her. That was the 3rd winter they'd done it. 400 people, and every one of them knew whose calves stood in the schoolteacher's pen, and not one of them had ever breathed a word of it to Harlan Pruitt. But a thing kept by 400 people is a thing that gets harder to keep every year. And Pruitt had begun to wonder. It was Barnes did it, in the end. Not meaning to. Pruitt was at the store in January, and a freight man down from Fairbank was warming at the stove, and the talk got round to the widower Barnes and how he'd set his cap for the Cimarron schoolteacher and been kept waiting. "Can't figure it," the freight man said. $55 he's offered her, and his own house, and she sits up here on 40 and a sod room. What's she staying for? And Harlan Pruitt, behind his counter, went very still. He had wondered before. Now he began to look. He was not a stupid man. He was a proud one, which is worse. He asked around, quiet, the way he thought was clever. But you cannot ask around in a county that has spent 4 years agreeing not to answer. Every man he asked looked at his boots and said he didn't know a thing about it, and every one of them went home, and the word ran ahead of Pruitt faster than Pruitt could walk. It was Nils Halverson's little brother finally, a boy of 9 who didn't know the shape of the secret, who said the wrong thing in the store, said his brother was minding the teacher's cows all winter. 11 of them. Fine red cows with a burned mark on the hip. "What mark?" said Pruitt. The boy didn't know. But Pruitt knew. There was only one outfit ran red cattle north of the river, and Pruitt had bought beef off it for 10 years, and he knew the broken R the way he knew his own name. He stood in his empty store a long time after the boy left. And then he called the board. Clara was back by then. It was March, the ground breaking up, the smell of it coming through the sod walls. She'd been back a month, and the herd had wintered clean, 11 head come through to spring, and she'd thought, she had let herself think, that this might be the year she stopped feeling like a woman on the edge of being asked to leave. Pruitt sent word for her to come to the store of a Thursday evening. The board would sit. There was a matter of her renewal. She knew what it was before she walked in. You always know. 2 teachers before her had walked into rooms like this one. Miss Deakins, dismissed before Christmas. Miss Pauline Ott, let go under the morals clause for the appearance of an attachment. Nobody had touched either of them. Appearance was all it took. Appearance was the whole of the clause. The board sat at the counter that served as the board table. Pruitt in the middle. 2 other men she'd taught the children of. A lamp turned up between them. "Miss Vess," Pruitt said. "Sit down." She sat. She kept her hands still in her lap. "There's a question come up," Pruitt said, "regarding cattle. It said you keep a herd. Red cattle. Broken R stock. Amos Renner's mark. I keep 11 head," Clara said. "That's true. How does a school teacher on $40 come by 11 head of a rancher's cattle, Miss Vess?" She looked at him. She could have named it. She could have said, they were driven north to me 4 springs running, and I never asked for one of them, and never spoke to the man once. She could have thrown the whole county's silence on the table and let it lie there. And she did not. Because to explain it was to hand Pruitt exactly what the clause fed on. The appearance. The attachment. She would not do it, not to save the school, not to save herself. "They're mine," she said. "Come by honest. I'll not say more than that." "The clause is plain," Pruitt said, and there was something almost sorry in it, which was worse than if there hadn't been. A teacher's conduct must be above the appearance of impropriety. An arrangement of this kind, with a single man, unexplained. "Then don't renew me," Clara said. The room went quiet. She stood up. She was very calm. She had been calm for 9 years of trunks, and she was calm now. "I've taught your children 9 years, Mr. Pruitt, 30 of them some terms, in a sod room, on $40, and I taught them well, and you know it. If the county won't have me because I own 11 cows it can't account for, then the county can find another teacher. I'll be gone by the term's end. I'll take my trunk and my herd, and I'll go." And she meant it. That was the terrible thing. She would have gone. Herd and all, 1 trunk and 11 head, a woman who had never in her life been allowed to keep anything, ready to load up and drive south with the only thing she'd ever grown, rather than name the man who'd grown it for her. She went home, and she started, quietly, to make ready to leave the county she loved. Then the 5th spring came. Branding Day, and no calf was driven north. She woke on Branding Day morning, and she went to the door before she was hardly awake, the way she had 4 years running, and the half-acre pen stood empty in the frost. Just her own 11 head out on the grass beyond it, breathing steam. The pen empty. The gate latched. Nothing standing on the frost at all. She told herself it meant nothing. She waited a day, 2. The pen stayed empty. And on the 3rd day, she began to understand it, the only way she knew how to understand a silence, which was as the plainest and hardest thing. He had stopped. Whatever it had been, pity or fondness or some private notion of his own, it was over. Maybe he'd heard about the board. Maybe the word had reached the broken R that Pruitt had moved on her under the clause, and Amos Renner had done the decent thing and let her go, cut her loose before he cost her the school entire. Or maybe he'd simply married. Men did. She'd never had any claim on him. She'd never had a word from him to have a claim on. 9 days that pen stood empty. 9 days she got up and looked at it, and it was empty, and each morning it hollowed her out a little more, and she was ashamed of how much, for a man who'd never spoken to her. On the 9th day the Torvald boy came riding up from the broken R. He was 15 or so. The boy Renner used to walk the calves north. He came up on a rough little horse, and he got down at her gate awkward, the way boys are, and he took his hat off. And he did not bring a calf. He brought a paper. "Mr. Renner says to give you this, ma'am," the boy said, "and he says you're free to tear it up. He says to tell you that particular, that you can tear it up and no hard feeling, and he'll not trouble you again." Clara took it. Her hands were not quite steady. It was a stiff folded document, an official thing, a seal on it and a register's stamp, and lines filled in a clerk's copperplate hand. It was a patent. A land patent. From the Fairbank office. A quarter section. 160 acres of the territory, entered under the Homestead Law of the United States. And the name filled in on the line, the sole entrant, the name that owned it, was Clara Vess. She read it 3 times before it went in. The 5th calf had not come north this spring, because there was no 5th calf to come. The value of that heifer, the one he'd have cut and driven, had been carried to the land office instead and laid down as a filing fee on 160 acres of ground. Ground that lay, she saw from the description, hard against the north line of her own school pen. Adjoining hers, she sat down on the step of her sod house with the paper in her lap. He says, the boy went on, careful, reciting it, getting it right. He says he'd have done it years back, but he couldn't. He says a word out loud would have cost you the school inside a term. He says that's why he never spoke. Said you'd understand that part now, on account of the board. And it broke over her then, all of it, 4 years of it, in the cold spring morning on her own doorstep. The silence had never been shyness. It had never been a man who couldn't get his words out. It had been the most careful thing anyone had ever done for her in her life. 2 teachers gone before her for the appearance of an attachment. Miss Deakins. Miss Ott. And Amos Renner had known that clause the way the whole county knew it. And he had understood, 4 years back, that the one thing he could not do, not once, not a single spoken word, not a basket bought at a box supper, not a good morning on the road, was let it appear. Because the appearance would have been enough. The appearance would have cost her the room and the children and the $40 and everything she had. So, he had said nothing. For 4 years he had said nothing, and instead he had sent her the one thing a board could not vote away. Not words. Words would have ruined her. He'd sent her increase. Cattle that grew while she slept, that wintered without him, that carried no man's name but a mark on the hip. And now, when it counted, he had turned the 5th one into ground. 160 acres in her own name. Land no board on earth could decline to renew. She understood, sitting there, that the box supper he'd bought nothing at, the hay that had come to her pen one December, with no name on it, the gate rehung while she was in Kansas, all of it had been a man loving her the only way that wouldn't get her fired. "Ma'am," the boy said, "you want I should tell him you tore it up?" "No," Clara said. Her voice came out rough. "No, you tell him I've got it. You tell him it's kept. Now, here is the thing about 160 acres in a woman's own name. A board can end a term. It cannot end a deed. The morals clause had teeth because Clara had needed the school. Take the school, and she had nothing. No roof, no pay, no reason the county was bound to let her stay. That was the whole of Pruitt's power, and it was the whole of the power that had run every teacher's life in that country since there'd been a school. But a woman with a quarter section in her own name did not need the board to let her stay. She lived on her own ground, whether they renewed her or not. Amos Renner had not just given her cattle. He had spent 4 years quietly building her the one thing that made the clause a dead letter. And he knew it now, and so he came. The board sat again that same week to settle the matter of her renewal for good. Pruitt behind his counter. The lamp. The 2 other men. Clara came, in her one good dress, with the patent folded in her bag and the tally book with it, the 2 records she'd told nobody she meant to lay down together. Pruitt had his say first. Same as before. The clause. The appearance. The cattle unexplained. "I'm bound to tell you, Miss Vess," he said, "that unless this arrangement is accounted for, this board cannot in conscience." The store door opened. Amos Renner walked in. 4 years, and Clara had never heard the man complete a sentence. The whole county turned in its chair. He came in with his hat in his hand and the cold off his coat, a broad, quiet man in his middle 30s. And he stood in the lamplight at the end of the counter and he looked at Harlan Pruitt. And then he spoke, out loud, in front of every man there, for the first time in this whole story. "Evening," he said. "I hear there's a question about the schoolteacher's cattle." "There is," said Pruitt. "They're mine that were," Renner said. "I cut 1 heifer off my herd every branding day these 4 years and sent it up to her pen. Nobody made me. She never asked. She never once spoke to me about it, and I never spoke to her. And if you want to know why, Pruitt, it's because I know your clause, and I wasn't going to be the man that cost her the school. So, I said nothing. 4 years I said nothing." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm saying it now." Pruitt's face had gone the color of tallow. "Then you'll understand," he began, "that this is precisely the appearance. There's no appearance to it anymore," Renner said. "This spring I didn't send a calf. I took what that calf was worth, and I filed her a quarter section at the Fairbank Land Office. 160 acres against the north line of her pen. It's entered in her name, Pruitt, sole entrant. Clara Vess. She's got the paper on her right now." He let that sit in the room. "So here's where you are," Renner said, and his voice never rose, and that was the worst of it for Pruitt. "You can decline to renew her term. That's yours to do. You're the board." He looked at Clara for the first time, and then back at the storekeeper. "A board can end your term, Miss Vess. It cannot end your herd, and it cannot take a woman off her own ground. She lives here now, whether you keep her or not. The only question you've got left is whether the Cimarron country wants the best teacher it's ever had teaching its children, or wants to hand her to Fairbank over 11 cows and a jealous clause." Nobody spoke. The lamp hissed. Clara stood then. She did not perform. She had never once performed for these men, and she did not start now. She set the patent on the counter, and beside it the tally book, the nickel tally book with its soft corners, and she put her hand flat on the 2 of them. "Renew me or don't, Mr. Pruitt," she said. "It's all one to me now. You can decline to renew a teacher. That's the board's right, and I've never argued it." She tapped the deed. "But you can't unkeep a herd this county already helped me winter. Half the men in this room fed my cattle while I was in Kansas. Ask them. It's done. It grew while you weren't looking, and it's mine. And I'm staying on my own ground either way." Harlan Pruitt looked at the 2 records under her hand, the deed and the tally book, and he was a proud man, and proud men are slow, but they are not always stupid, and he could count. A clause aimed at a woman who owned her own quarter was a clause aimed at nothing. He'd fire her, and she'd stay anyway, on her land, and Fairbank would take her salary, and the county would have the shame of it forever. He cleared his throat. He blotted something that didn't need blotting. "The board," he said, "sees no reason not to renew Miss Vess for the coming term." And that was the death of the morals clause in the Cimarron country, though it took him a moment to know he'd killed it. Julius Barnes had offered words. She thought about that later, on her own porch, on her own quarter, the summer after. He came up one more time from Fairbank, honest to the last, and he asked her plainly on the step of the house she was building on her own ground. She answered him plain, because he'd earned plain. "You gave me words, Mr. Barnes," she said. "Good ones. Honest ones, out loud in the daylight, and I'll think well of you the rest of my life for it." She looked south, toward the low line of the broken R 11 miles off. "But there was a man gave me 4 years of not saying a word, because saying it would have cost me everything I had. He built me a way to stand on my own feet before he ever let himself want anything back. That's the one I'm going to marry." And then she said his name out loud, for the first time in the whole of it, the way you say a thing you've decided to keep. "Amos," she said. The ice the whole story had metered, degree by degree, finally showed at the surface. Barnes took it well. He was that kind of man. He tipped his hat, and he wished her joy, and he drove back to Fairbank, and in time he married respectably down there, and he always spoke well of the Cimarron schoolteacher who'd turned him down for a rancher who couldn't talk. They married that fall, in the county, and the whole 11 miles of it came, because the whole 11 miles of it had been keeping room at that wedding for 4 years, without ever saying so. Odessa McTeague stood up in her 6 years of black and toasted them dry-eyed and sharp-tongued, and the men who'd wintered the herd toasted too. And Harlan Pruitt came and tipped his hat and called her, with only a little stiffness, Mrs. Renner. A year on, it was branding day again in the Cimarron country. Spring, first thaw morning, the creek ice going soft, the grass coming green. The half-acre school pen was a proper corral now, out on the north quarter, and the herd that ran in it come to 15 head. Clara stood at the fire with the iron in her hand. Her own iron. She'd registered it herself at the county seat, in her own name, the broken R, and joined to it a V, his mark and hers run together in one brand. She set it to the hip of her own first heifer, calm and sure, and the smoke came up, and the mark she'd once found burned on a strange calf on a frozen morning, the mark she hadn't even known, was hers now to lay on her own stock, with her own hand. A thing done to her once, a thing she did now. The schoolhouse was still hers, the 30 children still hers. The land, at last, hers, almost worked the broken R 11 miles south and rode north to her every evening, and he still wasn't much of a talker, and she had stopped, long ago, needing him to be. He never said a word in 4 years. He sent her the only thing that compounds. Pruitt tips his hat these days and calls her Miss Vess of the North Quarter, from old habit, and lets it stand as a kind of respect. Barnes speaks well of her in Fairbank still. And the county that knew the whole thing all along, and shielded it, and never once told, the county just smiles, and says nothing, the way it always did. If you've ever worked years for something, and been left with nothing that was yours to keep, I hope you find your quarter section. And if this one warmed you tonight, tell me the name of your town in the comments. I'd like to know what country you're listening from.